Senior scientist.
So shall we start? That's good.
It's good.
Okay, welcome everyone, both in person here at the Maison Française and online. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker today, Jérôme Chave, who's somebody that we've been collaborating on various aspects of tropical forests for 2 decades now, I think, in various forms. And Jérôme is senior scientist at CNRS in Toulouse, in France, and it's great to have him over here. It's also great to have this joint event with the Maison Française, which is the second in a series of events that we're linking with our ecological and biodiversity interest in Oxford with the Maison Française and with a broader band of collaboration in France that we're hoping to encourage through these activities. So thank you for coming over from France and missing the PCR test requirement by 2 days. Just squeezing in there just in time. And thanks for making it over here, Jérôme.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much, Yadvinder, for your invitation, for having me here today. Thank you also to the Maison Française d'Oxford for inviting me. I'll try to move on to the screen sharing mode. I'll try to do this. Okay. Share the proper screen. This one below. Yeah. And then I move that to full screen. And yes, okay. Can you all see the same thing remotely? Yeah, are you good? Okay. So thank you very much, Pascal Marty, for inviting me and the team of Maison Française. It was a great pleasure. I'll be talking today about forests and tropical forests, but not only. As you know, we've been through a long process with COP26 in Glasgow in UK.
It's not full screen.
It's not full screen, so I'll swap this. It's probably better now. Okay, I think it's better now. Okay, and this COP26 had interesting. It was an interesting experience for a lot of us, and it involved talking about a number of concepts, including the global stocktake. So what is the global stocktake? This is a global initiative aimed at assessing the global the inventory of carbon globally. And some of you may think that's already done, actually. And yes, it is, but this is an initiative from the UNFCCC, and so it's the countries have to do this. And one of the really important components of this is the land use change and forestry component, which I'll be talking about today. So I'll be talking about these different aspects. How do I move? Okay. So the scientific consensus is provided by colleagues of the Global Carbon Project. As you know, carbon dioxide has been increasing in the atmosphere, and this is due to increasing emissions. And the accounting of these emissions is fairly well known today. We have good numbers, and for 2019, the numbers were around 43 gigatons of carbon dioxide emitted for just 1 year. You see the small dip, which is due to the COVID crisis in 2020. And so the land use change component used to be a large proportion, over almost 50% 70 years ago, and it's now only less than 10% of the total. So, but this is really important component, and most importantly, it's also a tropical component today. So this is why I put this figure, reminding myself to tell you that, of course, this land use change and forestry component is really very much a concern of the global south today, and this is something that is of course a concern, but could also be mitigated. So what I'd like to do today is to think about several related topics, hopefully related topics. One of them is ask what was the similar problem back 250 years from today in Europe. So trying to understand how we've built forestry in European countries based on the problem of wood management and forestry management, really briefly. Then talk about also quite briefly about biodiversity and the issue of how to protect biodiversity in forests. And there will be a really brief bit of my talk, and then move on to assessing how can we better contribute to this land use problem in the global stocktake by using new data and new strategies. And finally, the uptake of my talk was hopefully be to say that, well, forests could be also a solution to many of the problems we're facing to some extent. So, yeah, I need to. So the historical perspective I'd like to share with you is that, of course, forests have always been very important for our societies for a very long time, and they've contributed to a lot of the knowledge we have, but also in art, in the political aspects of our societies have been shaped to a large extent by our management of wood products. And this is just a picture showing the nice nave of a cathedral in France that has been constructed almost fully in pieces of wood that have not been cut too much in the 13th century. So you see the amount of technology that has been into these construction buildings is quite remarkable. And so that's just an illustration of how important this was. We have very good data about forest coverage in our countries. And I'll try to take always examples from the UK and France, not to keep an even balance, because we are in the Maison Française here and because we're in the UK. So what is quite nice actually to see is that we are increasing, as you well know, we're increasing the forest cover in the UK, both in UK and France, but by remarkable amounts. The amount of forest cover has trebled over the past 150 years in the UK, and also has doubled in France. And this is because, of course, the pressure on yes, this is something I could lift here.
Change the view. That's better.
Is that better? Yes. Sorry, I didn't see this. So this has, of course, a really simple explanation that forest as a resource was very important back 150 years ago when it was the only energetic resource, and it's not anymore. So there are different types of uses of the forest, and the land is also used very differently today. So we can see that the practice and the approach to forestry has changed quite drastically over 150 years in our countries. We can see that the public discourse on the forest has also changed quite a lot over this time. And this is seen in social scientists are really interested in this Ngram viewer by Google. I don't know if you've played with this, but it's really cool. So if you plug in the word wood and bois, which is the French version, you see a very different picture here. There is a really strong uptick in 1750 in the UK. Wood became a really important concern, apparently, in 1750. And you know, this is the time of the Enclosures Act and the end of the Jacobite wars in Scotland. And so a lot of things went that came into play into making wood a very important topic. And the same happens at the end of the revolution in France, where wood became a really important topic, especially because a lot of forests were a property of the clergy at the time and became a property of the state and had to be sold, by the way, to reimburse Britain after the Napoleonic Wars. So during the first 20 years in the first of the 19th century, this was a really important part of wood was a very important part of the public discourse. So we could ask ourselves, what was the energetic deal of our countries in 1750? So if you look at, I don't want to bury you under numbers, but if you look at the energetic constraints of a household, some numbers float around. There is actually a huge literature on this topic. And it's possible to convince yourself that basically the average human in a household needs a quarter hectare per capita per year to survive for firewood, basically, consumption. So there are numbers here that are put in the slide, but we can discuss about this exact numbers and the validity. So it actually turns out that if you look at the population sizes of Great Britain at the time and the area of forest at the time, the numbers match pretty much, and the same for France. So it sounds like the resources, wood resources, were absolutely optimized for the two countries. The problem was for the Great Britain that the provisioning problem was really important. And for some scholars, it seems like the most important problem was actually getting the wood in the proper place, especially as Great Britain became urbanized. So at the time, what used to be called sea coal was becoming much more of use, and that led to the radical increase in the 19th century. But already at the time, it seems like the problem was not so much having enough wood for population, but having the wood in the proper places. The situation of France was really different in that forests were spread out much more evenly, but there was an important topic and a lot of discussions about wood being a limiting resource, even in the 17th century. And I point you to this book, if you haven't read it yet, by Joachim Radko on wood and the history of wood in Europe, especially in Germany, of course, but he's been covering a lot of different areas. So careful management of wood was the rule, and local regulation was in place throughout Europe. Forest management became also an instrument of power. And you see, by that time, the state became really central to the management of wood. And one important aspect of this story was that because wood shortage was so important, some strategic solution had to be taken. In France, for instance, in the southwest of France, the area of Les Landes was covered in the middle of the 19th century by a whole forest, brand new forest from nothing. The land means heathlands in English, and it was covered in forest by engineers. And it was also a very important aspect of the colonial discourse in both countries, actually, into going to colonize country for wood. On that topic, if you look at the narratives of powers and policy for countries like Madagascar, it's really remarkable to see this, what went into the justification for why these areas had to be colonized. And the dominant narrative was that forests covered nearly all of the countries, and it's not only Madagascar, actually, it was in several places. And so what the colonists saw was already a very degraded, so quotes and quotes, area due to the mismanagement of the local populations. And so it had to be protected somehow by imposed colonization and regulations. And the person who wrote this is a botanist, a well-known botanist, Perrier de Labattie, in 1921. He also provided deforestation rates at the time, which were in the order of 200 to 400,000 hectares per year, which is a very high number. So when I was reading the story, I've actually never been to Madagascar. I'm just providing this part as an example of really, well, it's a fascinating country and also a very very important for conservation. But then I came up with this paper by colleague Ghislain Vieillidan from Montpellier, and they've been working really hard at trying to mapping the extent of tropical forests in Madagascar. So one big problem there is what is the potential area of tropical forest? It seems that there are really three different types of biomes. The dry forest biome here on the west, the moist forest biome, which is the classic, tropical forest that we know of, and the spiny forest in the south. So restricting the data only to the moist forest, those data are taken from my speculation rather than from Ghislain's paper. So I don't take, I take the blame for any mistake I may have made with this data. But he's been able to reconstruct a mapping of tropical moist forest all the way back to 1958. And also to reconstruct the mapping all the way recently, which is obviously easier. And when you very bluntly estimate the cover of the forest back to the very early periods of the colonization at the end of the 19th century, you see, and you can estimate that the deforestation rate was around 80,000 hectares per year, which is much less than what Perrier de la Bâtie was estimating, but still as a very large number. And so I have no evidence whatsoever that these numbers are correct. But what's interesting there is that we can propose a very simplified scenarios that when the colonists arrived in Madagascar, 2/3 of the forest was still there, and that a lot of the talking about the massive deforestation caused by the Malagasy people before colonization was pure speculation, and that colonization alone caused a third of the forest to disappear, directly or indirectly. And then there is another story after the end of the colonization, which is, as we know, a furthering of the deforestation. But there is a number in 1917 that 2.5 million hectares of forest was left in Madagascar. And this is in the writings of Humbert. And this is, of course, way off of any estimation we have today. So this a long story short is that the narrative was completely incorrect. So Christian Kuhl from University of Lausanne has written a very interesting paper 20 years ago about these narratives, writing, and I quote him, that in Madagascar, environmental myth historically contributed to the conclusion that protected areas are the best strategy for conservation. Tavy and grassland fires should be banned, and land use should be put under more rational management. And his conclusion is that the traditional protected area approach that arose from such ideas has been strongly criticized for leading to resource scarcity, marginalization of the poor, and problems of coercion and resistance. So this play of historical play, I think, is very much in place today in the tropics by superimposing some worldviews about forests, which are no longer true in Europe, but are imposed upon different countries. So a slightly different, connected but different topic is where do forests stop? And there is it's a slight digression here, but it's really important, especially in the context of tropical countries today, to ask ourselves should we protect only tropical forests, or should we protect all fragmented forests? In the UK alone, some 20% of the cover is not forest. It's actually what's classified by the National Forest Inventory as small woods or lone trees. And that significant area, and in terms of diversity, is very important. From Oliver Rackham's books that you know much better than I, is a classic example of biodiversity being maintained in hedgerows, for instance. I wanted also to mention that recently we've been collaborating on projects to try to use remote sensing information to identify trees using very high resolution imagery, optical imagery, combined with basically artificial intelligence, which I know nothing about, so don't ask any question. But the point is that many areas that have been classified as non-forested or even non-covered by any type of vegetation actually have a significant proportion of vegetation. And this is a very crucial type of vegetation because it supports a large biodiversity. So in areas that classify as semi-arid in West African Sahara, 5 to 10% of the area is covered by trees. And it's completely neglected in terms of photosynthetic activity, in terms of functioning, and in terms of the use of this forest. This type of approach opens an infinite potential for different opportunities. One of them is to try to look in a different way as allometric relationship between the proportion of trees and their number. So if you try to play with this, and this is in the paper, if you try to construct a distribution of the number of trees per diameter sizes, you come up with these very nice figures of basically a straight line in log transformed y-axis, showing that the crown diameter distribution is very simply exponentially distributed in this arid ecosystems, and that the slope of this exponential distribution depends on just one thing, is the rainfall regime. So I have no answer as to the question of whether this is also valid in other arid areas, but that would be a really interesting question to ask, especially like in Mexico or in Australia or other places. But I thought it's a related and interesting digression to share. Now, moving on to the biodiversity aspect, of course, it would be an infinite topic to cover. But going back a bit into time, a classic theme in the UK anyway has been to find ancient forests as clusters of biodiversity. And again, there is the history of Oliver Rackham's fantastic books that have been playing a really huge role in there. So 30% third of the forest area is considered by the Nature Conservancy as old forest. Exactly the methodology behind this is not completely clear to me, but I'd be happy to know more. There is an equivalent example in France for trying to come up with these numbers, which is based on the Cassini map. Do you know what the Cassini map is? This is a map that has been made in 1750. Actually took 4 decades to complete because France is a large country, and it's a wall-to-wall map of France with different forests and different features. And using this map, colleagues from the forestry commissions have tried to map the recent maps and the old maps and find what are the areas that remain forests throughout this time. And they come up with actually quite remarkably similar numbers as in the UK. 30% of the forest roughly has remained forest for 250 years. So if you look at on the map, this is an area near Chateaubriand, and here you have the new forest that used not to be there in the Cassini map, and the old forests are in dark green in this example, which is just 10 kilometers or a few dozens of kilometers across. So this is as ancient forests should be a conservation target, and I think we all agree on this. But thinking about this in preparing this talk, let me to connect some dots. Again, this is the question is that when we have these highly disturbed areas, and we have more and more of these in the tropics as well, we run the risk of missing species extinctions. This is a very important problem, obviously. And a colleague of mine in my lab, actually working in my lab, has come up with ideas here, which I'd like to share with you today. So the question is, how many species have gone extinct before being described? Now, there is a theory behind this, which is basically if you have a sequence of species being described one after the other in a given sequence with a date attached to the identification, and you have also a process that eliminates the species at a constant rate, then you're likely to miss, of course, the species that have gone extinct early on. So that's the classic concept. And you can imagine that we can turn this into a stochastic process of discovery. It's like a birth death model as a stochastic process. So the equations here are don't get them too seriously, but how do I take this away? Will it get away? Okay. So my colleague Pablo Tedesco, who came up with this small model a few years ago, he came up with these few equations which are not super important, except that you can come up with a number of total extinctions based on just two informations: the total number of observed extinctions in the system, and then the sequence of accumulation of discoveries, of species discovery, which is usually a curve that is saturating through time. In most cases, I'll see some exceptions. So I took one example because we are against French-UK friendship. I took St. Helena as an example. No, the real reason is that we have really good data, and what's his name, Cronk from Cambridge, who's now in British Columbia, has spent a lot of time trying to quantify and identify the plant species of St. Helena. It's a tropical island, as you know well. It's been discovered in 1502, and it's been a remarkably documented. The deforestation has been really well documented because the English East Indian Company has kept really careful records of what has been done there. It's been documented in Richard Grove's fantastic book on green imperialism, and the end story is that there used to be 48 extant plant species, of which 8 have gone extinct, including some woody species, which are classic examples of plant species extinctions, like the St. Helena redwood and the ebony, were used for tanning or for no real purpose and were extinct because of goats, I think, which went loose in the island. Now, the Tedesco model methods consist in fitting the green curve here to one of the equations I showed before, which gives you one of the parameters, two of the parameters, and the third parameter is just the species extinction, the observed species extinction. By using this method, you come up with 17 undescribed extinctions, which is far more than the extinction that we were expecting. And you see that the accumulation of species discoveries were actually quite slow compared with the number of species. So what happens in the tropics? Well, in the tropics, we have no clue, and I would be a really interesting project I'd like to continue, maybe with some of you if you're interested. But I took just the example of Madagascar for the sake of consistency of my talk. But you see, the look of new species descriptions for trees, for plant species in Madagascar is not even saturating, it's still accelerating. So it means that even the method doesn't work. There are also other methods that could be used for the same purpose, but this not this one. So better documenting past deforestation would help reassess the long-term impact of man on biodiversity. And of course, deforestation, that we know that full well, as that may have already had a much higher contribution to species extinction than documented. So the problem here I wanted to raise that the shifting baseline, not only for the tropics, actually, even for Europe, maybe we've lost a lot of species in the past that we don't want to account for. In terms of conservation, we don't want to hear this message too much, because we want to emphasize the drastic impact we're making today on nature. And this delta is more impressive is if the baseline extinctions are low. But I think in terms of accuracy, it would be better to address this question better in the future. So the last point in my talk, I'll take another 10 minutes if you allow me, is to go back to the global stocktake and go back to the COP 26, which was called, not a drastic success in terms of achieving some targets, but was not so bad. And so basically, if you look at this global stocktake mechanism, what has to be taken in mind is that it will take a while anyway before any decisions being taken. So I know my when I explain this to my kids, they don't want to hear this. They want to have urgent solutions. And they're right, but it's also a really complex mechanism involving over 200 countries, almost 200 countries. And it takes time for that to be put in place. So the latest synthesis is actually a contribution of all the countries, which is called nationally determined contribution, the NDCs. And these NDCs, they come up with a number of what the countries think they've emitted. And this number is 52 gigatons of equivalent CO2. So it's not so far away from the emissions estimated by the Global Carbon Project. I said the number I provided you early on, but you've forgotten because there are so many numbers, is 43 gigatons of equivalent CO2. This number is higher because it takes into account methane and nitrous oxide, but it's pretty much on the same ballpark. The real problem is that some estimation have been overestimating by quite a lot, and the land use change forestry sector is very poorly estimated. There was a piece in the Washington Post a few weeks ago, I don't know if you've seen this one, going deep into each one of the NDCs and try to quantify how much had been missed in terms of this forestry sector. And it was huge, especially in tropical countries. Malaysia, for instance, has probably underestimated by almost all of its national carbon sink. It's actually quite remarkable, the type of mistakes. The number for the Democratic Republic of the Congo was probably way up by an order of 4, a factor of 4, sorry. So these numbers are really poorly estimated to a point that a lot of this is averaging out at the global level, which is good news. The bad news is that every country has a very poor vision of what it is emitting today. So the one way they're doing this is with a national forest inventory. And again, I'd like to come back to the history. The reason why every country has to go through nationally reporting their emission is that they have a system that is inspired by the French and the UK systems and the German system. The Swedes are excellent for that, and Finnish as well. All these countries have a lot of power and workforce to have an excellent national inventories. But many countries have starting just to implement national forest inventories, and the global forest the forest monitoring system is not so good. So one problem is that there is skills in managing the Earth observation. The remote sensing data is a challenge in some countries. It's not the most important challenge, but the global forest, the national forest inventory for countries like Colombia is just being started. For Brazil, it's been started a few years ago, but it's not yet completed for obvious reasons. And so all of this places a lot of burden on the countries with no clear value, given that at the end of the day, the NDCs are not really good at all. So one idea is to come up with a global system of forest monitoring. And there are a few caveats here. One of them is to come up with a new generation of Earth observation data, which would be much better than just estimating carbon stocks by Landsat, forest cover, multiplied by some multiplier, which is not really well known. And also coming up with a global forest inventory system that would validate this data and place trust into the data themselves. So in terms of the quality of the data today, I'm just showing you what we have. If you want to look at this data and play with them, it's no easy. We have placed together with NASA and ESA have this joint effort called the MAP, and it's online, the Earth data at nasa.gov, where you can play with these two maps. One of them has been a European initiative called CCI Biomass. It's based on a radar, ELOS radar. And on the right, you have the GPL map, which has been spearheaded by our colleague Sasan Sachi, who's been with you for some time, I think. And if you compare those two maps, it's kind of striking. It's just Amazonia. I picked Amazonia for obvious reason because many of you are working there. The west of Amazonia is completely overestimating in the CCI biomass map. And it's not really clear how these maps are really comparable and are trustworthy at all. So this is a big limitation, and this is the state of the art. So what can we do better? We can use JEDI, which is the new great LiDAR on board the International Space Station, which is not a wall-to-wall coverage of the world. It's just a sample, but it's much better than anything that's been done recently. Its goal is to estimate above ground biomass at a 1 kilometer resolution for 80% of the pixels, which is not 100%, and it's an important caveat. So what type of data do we have now? Well, this is the new data that came out last week, available for you to play with. It's really cool. Well, the caveat here is that you see there are a lot of blanks. So a lot of areas are poorly covered, of course, because those are really highly covered with clouds, and this is a problem. But you have a much better coverage that lasts before. And the canopy height is pretty nice. So with this data alone, we'll be able to do much better than before. And the west of the Amazon is actually high canopy height. I don't know if I can show that to you. Here, this area is actually high forest. And so whether it translates into high biomass is a different matter, and allometry should come into play. So the future of this is the Biomass Satellite, which should be launched in 2023. But the bottom line is that all these new data are coming right now, and we have a lot of opportunities to have this data available for the community. But this data will be of no value whatsoever if we can't validate them on the ground. So the last point of my talk is to try to, not to sell, but to convince, and I know it's an easy sell here, that we need more validations of global forest biomass maps. So the major challenge is to build trust towards remote sensing data in the user community. And as I said, remote sensing is of no value if not compared with ground data. So the group of Earth observation is convinced of this, and the CEOs, the Committee of Earth Observation of that satellite, basically all the remote sensing agencies have placed this problem as a top priority globally, including NASA, ESA, ISRO for India, CNES for France, and the others. So we want to come up with this project called GeoTree. It will not be a research project, it will be a platform that will take into account the existing networks of plots. Forest Geo, which includes Witham Woods, not far away from here, the Forest Plots Network, which is globally distributed, and the TMFO network of Tropical Managed Forest Observatory. And so this is called GeoTrees already, it's just starting, and this is really a supporting initiative to help remote sensing initiatives to gather more data on the ground. Now, the concept is as here, every site should be equipped with 10 sampling plots, 1 hectare sampling plots, where every plot will be monitored as in forest plots or rainfall forest geo above 10 centimeters, with an airborne coverage of at least 1,000 hectares, and with ancillary data like observation of deforestation and so forth, met stations and so forth. The sites are not chosen yet, of course, but many of the tentative sites are the neon sites in North America. Many of the sites you know better than me in Central and South America, in Africa, and in Southeast Asia. And we want to have a coverage of this system, which is proportional to the coverage of biomass in the tropics, which is roughly 2/3 of the biomass is in the tropics. So 2/3 of the effort should be in the tropics as well, as opposed to over sampling the temperate zone as it is today. So the why 100? Well, this is just a magic number. Really, we have no idea. But the cost for this initiative, if we really want to remeasure every 5 years those 100 sites, the order of estimate of the cost is 35 million euros. So it's not cheap, and basically doubling this will be also doubling the cost. So the real challenge is to come up with, reasonable funds to get it going. Now, this is building on existing networks. Many of them, the gem plots are here, and I'm sure Oxford is somewhere here, and this is, it probably should be also on this side, I don't know, but this is just to say that this is not building on nothing, and this is really important to be able to leverage on the awesome science that's been done in the past. Now, other geotrees activities would be data coordination. Funding of ground activity will be obviously a real challenge. Developing data analysis workflows, collecting ancillary data like terrestrial LiDAR will be really important in every plot like this one. Soil moisture, QC would be really important, and the data delivery to the user community would be super important. And by user community, we don't really know, but it could be a lot. So to finish, I like not to finish with a technical note, but more of a positive uptake. How can forests help in finding natural climate solutions? There are many ways, as we know, natural climate solutions have been a hype, and they've been the idea is that forests are probably the best solution to lock up, to mitigate the effect of climate change in the short run. It will not solve the problem at all. It's not an excuse for business as usual strategies. We know this well, but in the short run, it could be a good option. One option is plantations. Plantations have advantages in terms of reducing surface temperature, in terms of fluxes, but it's not really a great way of storing a lot of carbon. So there are caveats here. The bone challenge has been mostly about planting forests, but mostly planting plantation forests. And this is one strategy which may not be the best one. Another strategy is letting just nature do its business and nature regrow. There's good evidence now from papers by Robin Chasden, Lawrence Porters, and others that secondary forests hold a great potential for accumulating carbon naturally, and just as good as plantation forests. But the problem is the economic problem, obviously. Letting the forest as it is also an effective nature climate solution. And I won't talk about sustainable forest logging because I'm not an expert, and because I know very soon Plinio Cis will be giving a talk at OCTF. So I'll leave him this topic. But finally, this morning I received this paper. I could not fit it nicely in my talk, so I just added at the end, just saying that trees outside forests could also be a natural climate solutions. My colleague who've been working with AI technique to map forest trees pretty much everywhere in the open areas are now working on a project in Rwanda, covering the entire country of Rwanda. And it turns out that, like in many other countries, it's a sizable proportion of the forest of the tree cover is outside forests and is in this very complex mosaic of agricultural landscapes. So this, just look it up. I don't even know if it's out, but David Cole and Martin Brent are co-authors. So as very short conclusion, the historical perspective on land use change, and forestry helps understand political conflicts today, and maybe could be an element to consider when to explain why it takes so much time to bring different countries to an agreement with this climate challenge. Biodiversity protection should be promoted even in fragmented forests. I think this is the point of my second part of my talk. Forest biomass monitoring is now a global, not national priority, and it's making a lot of progress. I think as scientists, it's a really exciting time to be in because of all this new technology in space that could help concretely. We have great examples here in the Adventures group with the Sentinel-2 analysis, which is really a major step forward. But others are the satellites that are about to be launched. And finally, forests are an effective strategy for locking up carbon. I had to come up with this positive and optimistic conclusion. And with this, I would like to leave you with a dry forest in Magdalena Valley in Colombia, which is just beautiful. And thank you very much for your attention and taking any questions.
Thank you, Jérôme. That's a nice overview. I wasn't ready for all that historical Franco-UK perspective on forest. Nice to see, very interesting. We can open up to questions. Anybody have some questions?
I didn't share my screen.
You have one question.
So it's not a very interesting one, John, but while we've got you here to pick your brains, could you say a little bit more about, do you know more about the biomass satellite?
Could you repeat the question into the...
So the question is about the biomass satellite.
Yeah, how it will work. And so I think you said...
Yes, I had actually 5 slides on this, and I say, well, it will kill you if I... So this is a radar, synthetic aperture radar, which will be launched, and this is the very first time a SAR satellite will be launched at this band length, which is 70 centimeters, which is much more than everything we know. What's usually used for allospal SAR is a L band, which is 24 centimeters. And basically, if you think in terms of radar, the more lengths, the more wavelengths, the less the small object will be seen. So basically, this large wavelengths will see large objects, trunks and branches, and will take away all the leaf components. So it's the best strategy for quantifying biomass, and this is why it's been put into space. It used to be impossible to do this because of military regulations. It used to be a reserved military band until 25 years ago, but now it's possible. The caveat is that in some areas of the world, it's still forbidden because of the search for flying objects. So all the Western Europe and North America will not be flown by, or not imaged by biomass, which is the small catch of the story. For the moment, and until the DoD, the US DoD accepts to do this, but it's probably not tomorrow. If you need more, I'd be happy to send you documentation.
We have a question from online, the online team. So it's Kim Polgrim, and she's just spent the whole morning in Whiteton Woods with 55 teenagers measuring trees.
Awesome.
And she's asking, do you have any idea of how, I think it's a very difficult question to answer, but how many jobs would be created with the 35 million euros to monitor? So yeah, but you're saying we need to monitor, there's a huge increase in funding going into monitoring forests on the ground, and are you expecting lots of jobs being created?
It's a very interesting question. So I could say that mostly 2/3 or 3/4 of this amount is actually going into jobs in the south, in the global south. I mean, mostly in the south. So exactly in terms of number of jobs, it's more difficult to address, but it will. A lot of this activity is actually going boots on the ground and doing the monitoring and the measurements part. And this is something that's very difficult to explain to remote sensing agencies because it's really far away from their expertise, but they understand that it's really expensive. It's a really long-term effort, and that has to be done.
We talk about it a lot at the moment in the context of nature-based solutions in terms of short-term and long-term recovery. The creation, well, it's just, there's so much potential to create jobs through nature-based solutions, and it's not just the initial planting the trees or monitoring the trees, but it's the ongoing management.
Yes. Yes.
Jérôme, thank you. It was fascinating to hear all about the plans and what you are going to do in the near future. And I have kind of a more methodological question, or more kind of thinking about the data that you have and the group has and what is coming. And if you have thought about how to organize such a data set that is going to be huge about where species are and which species they are and where you have more or less, but kind of mixing it a bit more with the remote sensing component, kind of as something kind of this rural earth engine, for instance, where the spatial remote sensing data, but actually where you can actually bring about all these distribution of the points where the species are located, so that you can actually have only one kind of platform
Yes.
that the common user can actually go
Yes.
to, and instead of having to work in different platforms and try to deal with remote sensing here and then with the species data here, you know, something like that. I don't know what is your view for that?
Yes, the map I was quickly advertising is this ESA NASA initiative is exactly about doing this. It's kind of the Google Earth engine for all the data that are about to flow into the system. Keeping in mind that some of this data, like I haven't mentioned NISAR, which is the new generation of ALOS pulsar. It's an L-band radar, but it will be high temporal resolution, and it will provide mountains of data really. So the problem here is not even to access the data; it's to see them, because you cannot download them. It's too much. So the idea from NASA and ESA is that they want to create this platform where all the EO data would be available already native to the users without them having to download them to their Earth engine, and also to have the ground data attached to them. And then you would use I've learned about this recently, but Jupyter notebooks and all this technology where you can do your job locally. Yeah.
So I've got this question might seem a bit pedantic, but you touched on all these really interesting points about the colonial legacy in Madagascar of looking at areas as degraded and deforested when they weren't. And you also touched on the really nice idea of like mapping trees outside forests. So a lot of the problem with Africa with remote sensing is a lot of the high tree density savannas get mapped as forest, which then perpetuates into how do you manage these systems into the future. You shouldn't burn them. You should manage them as forests when they're actually not. So wouldn't this be a good time to get the definition right and map forests as forests and the open savanna systems as trees outside forests?
Yes.
And I see there's some seesaw plots in there, which are the Miombo woodlands, so that's what I'm generally talking about. And I mean, I suppose it's linked to the FAO definition of water forests. Right. But so what would you, how do you write this?
Yeah. Well, defining forest is very difficult. The bottom line is that the definition has been really based on the Landsat concept of fairly medium-sized resolution, where what can you see on the Landsat pixel? Know that we have much higher resolution. I'm even wondering if defining formally the forest versus non-forest makes a lot of sense. Actually, we can cover, a tree is a tree, and the tree could be within closed canopy or medium closed or medium open or whatever. There is a continuity, we know that full well. But it would be still important to distinguish between the different types of biomes. But then the transition zones are as important as the biomes themselves. And I think we can go this far. Whether this is what I've just said is operational is of course debatable, and it took a very long time for FAO to come up with one definition. I'm not too sure that you will be willing to move forward to the kind of very elaborate answers that I come up with today.
We have another question from online. It's Jamie Walker, and it's about I'll just read the question and then I can try to explain. How will you fit your ground truthing project with participatory tenure right and resource use mapping? So I guess the question is there an opportunity to also map?
Yeah,
tenure right? That's
a very interesting question, a very important one too. I've been thinking about this as trying to engage communities, and there is a bit of a problem here. Really high quality data need really high skill, really and training and long-term training, and people who, like yourself, who've been there trying to set up a plot. They know that there are a lot of problems setting up plots well and for a long time. So some applications may be participatory, but the core of the activity needs to be based on expertise. That is actually many of the countries already that have been built by a number of projects and colleagues, but need to be maintained. So the role for participatory science here would be trying to build up on this ground, some new ideas and some new projects. And Witham Woods example with students that was mentioned before is clearly an example for this. We need many more Witham Woods across the world, basically, to train new generations of scientists, students, and people concerned with this type of questions, which are broad. I mean, it's way beyond biomass questions, of course.
I guess there are two questions there. There's one that's the opportunity for participatory science, and the other is mapping land tenure.
Oh, yeah. The land tenure is easier. So trying to validate the data, the individual trees outside forest type approach. That has been done quite a lot. I think there's a project in Wales now that is ongoing, trying to map a lot of features and trees. And I don't know much about other projects, but yes, this is a much simpler and maybe accessible opportunity for participatory science.
We did have another one, but I'm not sure it's quite related to exactly what you've been talking about. It's about your allometric equations. It's a question from Talemos, and it is it possible to use allometric equations developed by you for forests in Ethiopia and Kenya? Or how can you integrate with others? Maybe that's one to
It's a good question.
with them online.
So there are a lot of allometric equations developed for across the world, and FAO has actually come up with a globe allometry website where they have a lot of the equations. There are thousands literally from different places. It's the problem with these equations that usually they have been constructed based on very small data set from very poorly documented initiatives. Like the Biomes data set that we were talking about this morning with the Advinder from the UK. It's quite interesting to go there to take the relevant allometric equation and to compare with the pantropical allometric equation to make sure that they match more or less. The power of large pantropical allometric equations that you have more trees at the higher end of the size classes, and so you tend to less underestimate this higher range. Now, people who've been working with LiDAR, terrestrial LiDAR, they can sample many more big trees, and they show that this pantropical allometric equation still underestimates slightly this large the much top trees, the largest trees. So this is something that will probably be solved in the future, but this is work, ongoing work. TLS would probably be the solution. For the time being, I think having a single equation for this problem is probably a good thing, because you're not mingling with different problems, and you don't start comparing apple and oranges, as you say. So yes, please use that equation and cite it. Short answer. No.
I was very struck, and I've did it before, but I'm very struck by the difference in biomass patterns between the JPL and the European sensors. And so my question there is that perhaps, is there an understanding of why the different sensors show different patterns? And also, if as a user now you're wanting best estimates map of tropical biomass, is there one that you lean toward, apart from being European, maybe Italy?
So yeah, it's a valid question. Thanks. My straight answer is to go for the GPL data. The GPL map is much more informed. It's much more fusion on many different sensors based on the glass data, yes, but it's also using MODIS data and others, and it's better validated and tuned regionally. The strategy of the CCI biomass is to come up with a purely physics-based algorithm with a one-size-fits-all across the globe, which is probably a good idea in many areas. It's actually a global map. So you go to Siberia, you'll also have a biomass value, and it's not doing so well in the tropics, in the moist tropics, because it's using mostly L-band radar, and L-band radar is not going through the canopy so well. So it's sort of underestimating and doing it has funny results in the close canopy forest. It's not really good, and it's not really appropriate for this. So there's been a number of strategies in the group to improve over this problem, but the close canopy forest will remain a challenge for the CCI Biomass Initiative. And we're all waiting for the JEDI data actually to put an end to the problem. So yeah, they'll go for GPL and go with the SANS approach.
We do have one more question from. We have one more question from the web, and it's linked to something I was going to ask. Actually, it's about the NDCs and the problems in reporting from the national forest inventories. My question was, national forest inventories, there was a lot of work done on them during the RED phase,
yes,
when we were working a lot on RED, and FAO was working with countries specifically there. So I thought there had been a lot of progress in there, but and then Kun is our colleague from Malaysia, who you might know, who is saying he's been trying to work on the Malaysian reporting and has a lot of doubts on the Malaysian NDC in particular. But they've been trying to defend the reporting based on many reviews they've gone through. So there's a big review process.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you have any insights specifically in Malaysia, but in general on why there's this problem.
Well, yes, I understand this is a really difficult real challenge for every country. So I'm not trying to put my fingers on this. I was just citing this paper from the Washington Post, which was giving Malaysia as an example of problem. And the problem was, as I understand from the paper, the problem was that the natural sink of forest was overestimated quite a lot, either because some areas were considered as forests, whereas they were not, or because, and more likely, because forests were taken to be a sink of an unlikely magnitude. It would be the sink of a forest which is just regrowing. And they applied this coefficient to all growth forest, which is just not appropriate. So why this problem came into the calculation, it's difficult to tell, because as you said, those calculations are complicated and involve a lot of people. So the point is that know that the real advance of NDCs is that all of this is transparent for everyone to see. And as said before, the progress has to be slow because it's all complicated. Now, the real advantage today is that we have comparison with Global Forest Watch. I haven't cited, but this is a fantastic initiative. And so you can kind of get the orders of magnitude values based on different sources and compare and see whether it's likely or unlikely. Now, Global Forest Watch is not perfect either. I mean, it has also problems, but let's see how science progresses.
Thanks.
One question is, so you started by saying that perhaps forests were one of the solutions for the carbon problem of the planet, and so what you are showing us is that there is a huge space for improvement in the quality of data. And, do you think it's possible to sort of assess the kind of progress we could bring into policies by just reducing the margin of errors in the forest estimation, for instance? Because you showed that the overestimation of forest in such and such places or in such countries can lead to a miscalculation of the commitments for reducing carbon. But by simple calculation, could we sort of estimate the margin of progress we could make by a simple, better assessment of forest in, for instance, the calculation of carbon commitments of the different states. This is what I want to say is that it's also a way of asking how can we, because all of us try to find solutions to improve the quality of the dialogue between science and policy. So perhaps simply by saying, okay, let's try to get a better use of the better data we can get, and from this, well, not simple because you showed that not simple and requires a lot of investment, but by getting better data, perhaps we can easily solve several problems or avoid several caveats we have in determination of the policy targets for several countries.
Yeah, but I'm not a policy expert, so I'm not really qualified to answer your question. In terms of data, the type of errors we have in terms of orders of magnitude, we have something close to 15 gigatons that are being overestimated or underestimated, given the standpoint in the reports, out of 50 gigatons. So that's 30%. This is the type of error we're talking about today. After all these years of building up with RED, with UNFCCC and so forth, so that's a lot of error. And the problem boils down to what commitments countries make, not only internationally, but also internally, within their countries. If they commit to change practices or to reduce emissions, they have to do this in a consistent manner. That's the principle of the UN. So at least by reducing this type of error, the hope is that the commitments by countries will be in par with their actual emissions and not some sort of random white noise process where everybody is paying for someone else, which is unacceptable in terms of policy making. But it's a really vague answer. I'm sorry about this. I can't go much further.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks
Thanks for attending. And thank you online.
Do you want to goodbye to our online audience as well?
Good one, everyone.